Welcome back, Rock Kids. We are in our Timeless Truth series looking at how God is the promise keeper. If God says it, we can be sure that it will happen because God always keeps his promises, just like our theme verse says. In Psalm 145:13b, it says, "The Lord always keeps his promises. He is gracious in all he does." We've looked at God as the promise keeper in the life of Abraham. He promises Abraham many descendants. This begins to be fulfilled through Isaac, Abraham and Sarah's only son. Last week we saw God provide a way of rescue with a lamb who died in Isaac's place, and that pointed us ahead to Jesus, who would be the lamb that would die in our place. Isaac grows up. I told you last week he marries the love of his life named Rebekah. Isaac and Rebekah have twins named Jacob and Esau, and even though the boys are twins, they really couldn't be more different. They're total opposites. It says in Genesis, as the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter. He was an outdoorsman, but Jacob had a quiet temperament, preferring to stay at home. Isaac loved Esau because he enjoyed eating the wild game Esau brought home, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So these boys, again, total opposites. Esau likes to be outside, he likes to be hunting, and his dad loves Esau the most because he provides wild game that tastes really good. And then Jacob prefers to be at home, he's quiet, he helps his mom a lot. We find him like cooking later on, and his mom loves him the most. And so this really isn't a good thing when two kids are competing for the love of their parents, and we find out that really it doesn't work out well for them at all. Esau is the older twin and Jacob is the younger. And so because of this, Esau would have a birthright and a blessing that he's supposed to get as the older son. This means he would inherit everything that was Isaac's when his father dies. It would become Esau's. But one day, Esau is out hunting. He comes back starving. He's so hungry. And Jacob has been at home preparing a delicious stew. Esau really wants some, and so he asks for some. And Jacob, being tricky Jacob that he is, says, "Sure, if you give me your birthright." And in that moment of weakness, maybe because he was so hungry, Esau agrees and he trades his birthright for a bowl of stew. Now, this might have made him a little bit angry later on when he realized what happened, but it's not until a little while later when Jacob tricks him again that he gets super angry. This time, their father Isaac is about to die, and he sends Esau away to go hunting so that they can prepare his father's favorite meal, because Isaac is going to give Esau the blessing. He's going to pray to God and ask God to bless Esau and his family. So Esau obeys, he goes away, and while he's gone, Rebekah and Jacob start scheming for how Jacob can trick his father into giving Jacob the blessing instead of Esau. Sure enough, Jacob lies, he tricks his father, he takes what isn't his by taking the blessing for himself, and now Esau is really mad. We find out that because of this, Jacob has to run away to his uncle Laban's house. This is because it says from that time on, Esau hated Jacob because their father had given Jacob the blessing. And Esau began to scheme, "I will soon be mourning my father's death. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." Esau is sure that he wants his brother dead, and so Jacob can't be anywhere around him. He leaves town and he heads to his uncle Laban's house. So we pick up in Genesis 28, and Jacob is a liar, he is a trickster, and he steals. He takes things that are not his. He's running away in his sin, and it's at this moment that God visits Jacob, and he talks to him, and here's what he says. "I am the Lord, the God of your grandfather Abraham and the God of your father Isaac. The ground you're lying on belongs to you. I'm giving it to you and your descendants. Your descendants will be as numerous as the dust of the earth. They will spread out in all directions, to the west and to the east, to the north and the south. And all the families on the earth will be blessed through you and your descendants. What's more, I'm with you, and I will protect you wherever you go. One day I will bring you back to this land, and I will not leave you until I have finished giving you everything I have promised you." So Jacob has run away, and he's in the middle of sin. He's made a mess of his life because of his bad choices, and it's at that moment that God comes to him and he gives him all these promises. You might recognize these promises. They're the promises that God gave to his grandfather Abraham. And God promised that Abraham would have this huge family, that they would have a special land that God had promised to them, and that through their family, the whole world would be blessed. God repeats all of this to Jacob, even though Jacob does not deserve it. He is in sin and his life is a mess, but God comes to him and says, look, these are my promises, and I'm going to fulfill every single one of them. This is because God is the promise keeper. Jacob doesn't deserve it, but God is still going to keep his promises. At this moment, Jacob commits his life to God. He decides he's going to follow him, and he goes to his uncle Laban's house. But things don't get easier for him. At his uncle Laban's house, he's tricked into marrying the older sister of the girl that he truly loves. And so after working 7 years for his uncle Laban, he ends up marrying Leah and decides, you know what, I still want to marry Rachel, the girl that I love. He worked 7 more years so he can marry Rachel too. Having 2 wives is not a good thing, and so his wives end up competing for his love the same way he and his brother competed for the love of his parents, Rebekah and Isaac. And so Jacob's 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, they start having as many babies as they possibly can because maybe then Jacob will love them more. This gives Jacob 12 sons, and then those 12 sons compete for the love of their father, just like his wives had. They get really angry because Jacob, again, he doesn't always do things right. He makes a lot of mistakes. He loves one of his sons more than all the others. That son is Joseph. And they get so angry that they sell Joseph as a slave. Joseph ends up in Egypt, but Jacob thinks that his favorite son has died. Later on, after the birth of his 13th son, the love of his life, Rachel, also dies too. What we see here is even though Jacob has promised to follow God, things in his life still aren't easy. He still makes mistakes, he still messes up, but God has made these big promises to Jacob, and God is the promise keeper. Even though Jacob is still a mess, even though he's still a trickster, even though he still doesn't love people well, God is going to keep his promises. This is because 2 Timothy tells us if we are unfaithful, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny who he is. In other words, when we mess up, if God has made a promise, he's still going to keep his promise, even though we've messed up. This is because God's promises are based on who he is, not what we do. God had made promises to Abraham, and those promises go to Abraham's children, to Isaac, to Jacob, to all of Abraham's descendants. God is the promise keeper. He is faithful even when we're unfaithful. He cannot deny who he is as the promise keeper. He's going to keep his promises. So he does. He gives Jacob these 12 and then 13 sons, and they would become the 12 tribes of Israel, and they're going to have many, many children. And we know that through Jacob's family, the whole world would be blessed. That's because, like we saw with Jesus' family tree, Jesus comes from the line of Jacob, from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God changes Jacob's name to Israel, and it's from his descendants, Israel, that we get the Israelites, who are the Jews, God's chosen people that he takes care of and eventually is going to bring back to that land that God had promised. He fulfills all his promises to Abraham through Isaac and Jacob's many sons, because God is the promise keeper. What we see through Jacob's life is that God always keeps his promises even when we don't deserve it. In fact, we can't do anything to deserve God's promises. Romans 5:8 says it this way: "But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners." In other words, God's biggest promise, the promise of salvation, a way of rescue when we put our trust in him, that biggest promise that he has made to us was made when we didn't deserve it. When we were still sinners, he sent Jesus to die for us. We hadn't done anything to deserve salvation, and he promised it to us anyway if we would put our faith, our trust in him. God always keeps his promises, even when we don't deserve it, because his promises aren't about us earning it. It's about who he is and his great love for us. This is really important because just like we saw with Jacob, sometimes we give our lives to God and say, you know what, you're going to be my Lord. I'm going to follow you. And then we still make mistakes. We still mess up. And we might think our sin means we don't deserve God's promise anymore. Do we lose our salvation? Do we not get to go to heaven anymore? But that's not the case because God is the promise keeper and he keeps his promises even when we don't deserve it. None of us could ever do anything to deserve heaven. It is the gift that comes from God because of who God is, because of his love and his grace and his mercy. We learn through Jacob's life that God always keeps his promises even when we don't deserve it.